Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Helen Marie Casey's short poetry collection, Fragrance Upon His Lips. So this is about Joan of Arc, Joan d'Arc, as I believe they say in French, though I don't speak French. So Casey is a poet who's very interested in the personas and the experiences of significant women in history. We saw the same thing with her collection, Inconsiderate Madness, which I did a video on before, which was about Mary Dyer, the Massachusetts Bay Colony Quaker martyr. In The Fragrance Upon His Lips, we have a similar sort of exploration of the life and experiences of Joan of Arc, particularly, and what Casey does that's really interesting is that she blends persona poems with descriptive poems, with reflective poems that sort of position her as a poet, looking back, or the speaker of the poem as a poet looking back and trying to make sense of these events. So we've got some poems here that are from Joan's perspective. We've got some that are from more minor characters' perspectives, whether that's clergy, whether that's English nobility, whatever it is. And so a lot of what she's exploring here is this sort of question of how we make sense of this remarkable and unusual human being. How do we make sense of a woman, a medieval woman called by God, no military experience, and yet she leads the French armies to these incredible, unexpected victories? Like, what is that? How do we find a place for that person in our conceptual schema, or in the medieval world's conceptual schema, I suppose? So that's a lot of what the poems are doing, is exploring, either from Joan's perspective or from other people's perspective, what exactly her experience means and how it can be made sense of. So, for instance, one of the poems that I really like here is called "The Doctors of the Church Search for Answers." And so, again, we've got that sort of sense of trying to make sense of this unusual person. So the poem goes like this. The learned fathers knew nothing of a God who prefers women in armor. Even when they probed, fog-coated all the evidence of the divine at work or play. She might have run away, but incapable of rejecting him, she planted herself in his path, listening for what she could never after tell. So we've got there a couple of significant things. One is this idea of the divine fathers, or the learned fathers, the churchmen who are supposed to explain supernatural, religious, theological phenomena, and they can't. They don't have, there's nothing in their conceptual schema here. They knew nothing of a God who prefers women in armor. They can't make sense of the idea that God would call upon this young peasant woman to lead armies and that she would succeed. But then the other thing that we have in this poem is that Joan herself doesn't know how to make sense of what's going on. The last two stanzas, she might have run away, but incapable of rejecting him, she planted herself in his path, listening for what she could never after tell. So, I mean, one of the things about Joan of Arc is that she heard voices that she ascribed to God, whether this was schizophrenia, whether this was a genuine visitation from the divine, whether this was hallucinogenic seeds that people baked into their bread unknowingly in the Middle Ages, whether this was just a sort of religious fanaticism of a deeply religious society within a deeply religious society, no one knows for sure. Different people believe different things. But what we get here is this clear indication that even Joan herself doesn't have a conceptual schema that allows her to make sense of what's occurring to her. But then the other thing that I find really interesting about this collection is how sexualized Joan of Arc is. So there are continual references to her body, references to her breasts, references to her legs. There's one poem that refers to her hairy mound. So we've got, and then she's continually referred to as a virgin or a whore. So we've got this fascination with her sexuality. And I want to read you this one poem, Disarming Jean the Maid. It's not necessarily the most overt about this, but it's in there, and it's important in there. This fascination with Joan as a physical sexual object. The Armagnac's whore was theirs. They were afraid to lift her visor, the eyes thundering hounds that made them turn for daggers before they dared. And then the rest. They separated her from all that had protected her. Helmet, breastplate, sleeves, gauntlets, leg armor, stockings. They pocketed her spurs and then unlaced her. Each fingered the red stain that marked her there behind her right ear. They looked long at the scars. They could not turn away from the breasts of the saint. She was 18 and would have made a good wife. So, actually, that's more sort of physically focused than I maybe suggested when I said it wasn't the most physically focused. But so again, we've got this fascination with Joan's body as an object, particularly a sexual object, but also a threatening object. But I think it's really, like, one of the things that I'm not 100% clear about here is why exactly so many of Casey's poems have this focus on Joan as a sexual object, a physical body. I want to think that Casey is sort of critically satirizing or drawing attention to the ways in which women are continually sexualized and objectified, particularly famous women. The textual, in my reading at least, the textual evidence for that this is a sort of subtle satire, I think the textual evidence is fairly slim. I mean, it's not, and that's actually, I think, a big challenge maybe with persona poems of this type, where we, at least for a lot of the poems, are sort of experiencing it from that character's perspective. Like, if you're a medieval English knight or whatever it is, and you have captured this young French peasant woman, chances are that you are going to sexualize her to some degree. And so the question becomes, is this Casey's attempt to think through the way that medieval people would have understood Joan and to be sort of accurate about it, including these sort of problematic objectifications? Or is this Casey attempting to say, look, here's, even when a woman is known for doing something that's completely non-sexualized, in this case, being a holy warrior who fights on behalf of God to liberate France, she will nevertheless inevitably be sexualized and be objectified. For me, the textual evidence is not necessarily that strong one way or the other. So while I want to think that it's the latter, that this is Casey subtly calling out patriarchy and sexism and the objectification of women, it's such a subtle critique, if that critique is there, that it may not be. And so I'm not going to sort of definitely state I think that's what's going on, but I tentatively think that's what's going on, and that's what I'd like to believe is going on here.